Hi, everybody. I am here with Paul Austin Ardoin, and we're going to have a little chat. And this is one of the videos for my day, my launch of Lies She Didn't Tell, which is book 4 in the Rowan Macfarlane Mysteries. And yeah, I think this will be a great chat, and I think you'll all enjoy it. So, Paul, you write the Fenway Stevenson Mysteries.
That's right.
Give everybody an introduction to your Fab series?
Oh, sure. And thank you for inviting me here. It's great to be here. I'm glad to have the opportunity to do this. So the Fenway Stevenson Mysteries. I'm now up to book 8. I'm in the middle of writing book 9 right now. It's about a nurse, like your surname, who who needs to move back to the California coastal town where her father is pretty much king. He owns just about everything. He's the CEO of a powerful oil company that's on the California coast. And with her background, her father sort of forces her into the vacant county coroner role there, and she solves mysteries. She solves the first mystery she solves is the murder of the previous county coroner, and that's what the first book focuses on. And it also focuses on her tumultuous relationship with her father. He abandoned her and her mother when Fenway was 8 years old, and now 20 years later, she's coming back to the town she doesn't really want to be in, with the only person in town she knows is her estranged father. And so it focuses on the mystery, of course, but throughout the course of the books, you see the relationship with the father change, and you see her find a fella, and so far the series has done pretty well.
Brilliant. I am a big fan of your series. I think that Fenway's a great character. I think that she encompasses quite a lot of really strong characteristics. Sometimes I think a little bit like Rowan, sometimes a little bit to her detriment, she can be a bit strong-willed. Do you enjoy writing that type of character?
Yeah, I do. Fenway is kind of an amalgamation of a few people that I know who are strong-willed women, and I really do like that. She can be a little headstrong from time to time, but she is fiercely intelligent and is not afraid to stand up for herself, both in conversations and physically, if it comes to that. Yeah, and I agree. There are a lot of similarities with Rowan in that she can be a little bit impulsive from time to time, but also really stands up for herself and shows that vulnerability too. I know that Rowan can be vulnerable from time to time, and I do. It's not just the. Oftentimes there's the stereotype of just the stoic male detective who can't show any emotions, and sometimes they're just the gender just changes for that. Yeah. In a lot of detectives, instead of showing a complete person, it's the cardboard cutout character just transitioned to be a woman instead. And I think that both Rowan and Fenway can show that they're multifaceted characters, and that they're not just men who are changed to suit the detective story.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I like about the Fenway series is that you have such a wide variety of backdrops to the mysteries that she solves. You've had like sports backgrounds, you've had like Masonic Lodge type backgrounds, you've had such a wide variety of events. How do you keep that fresh for your audience? How do you in that small like local town, how do you kind of keep those backdrops quite fresh?
Well, so the latest book in the series is called The Offside Coroner, and it is set against a backdrop of women's soccer in the US, women's football in the rest of the world. So there was an article that I read shortly before starting book 8. In the US, there's a professional women's soccer league called the NWSL. And a couple of coaches, one in particular of one of the most successful franchises in the women's soccer league, was accused of a lot of terrible things, and turned out, well, he had actually done those terrible things. A lot of it was coercion of having sex with the players, and a lot of other terrible stuff. And reading that, my blood just boiled over, as I imagine it did with a lot of women's football fans. And well, he is a very thinly veiled version of him is the victim in that book. Because it's a small coastal town, I could have the professional soccer team based there, but I did have their training camp, their preseason training camp based there, and he winds up dead in his hotel room. And then I thought about all of the people, if that happened in real life, who would be on the suspect list. Certainly the women who were brave enough to come forward with that would be certainly people of interest, persons of interest, and it just went from there. And I think there's the danger of the whole ripped from the headlines, because you don't want to be too close to that. But at the same time, there can be some things in your life that kind of trigger something that you're like, oh, I could write about that. I used to, when I was at university, I was in the English department. I majored in creative writing, but I took a class that was a Shakespeare play. So as the English department actually took A Midsummer Night's Dream and did everything about it, from the costumes to the music to the, it wasn't a theater production. They were English students who explored that play and went on a real deep dive with it. And the point was not to be like theater majors, but the point was to experience the theater. And the professor was very interested in the way it would have been done back in the day. We worked on the first folio and everything like that. Well, it turns out that his assistant had stolen like $500,000 from the organization that puts on these theater productions, and a thinly veiled version of her wound up dead in the stairwell at the university in my 4th book. So I've taken both things that are personal and things that are in the news to inspire my books.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot goes on in day-to-day life that doesn't necessarily hit the big headlines, or there are little things that you see or hear that definitely lodge in your brain. I think that one of the things I like to do is people watch, and so I look for like characteristics and the things people do and say. And I had a colleague a long time ago who loved drinking Red Bull and would regularly have like cold pizza for breakfast. And so I'm desperate to kind of like assimilate those characteristics into a character in the future, because I can kind of see how that would come together.
I think that'd be a great character. The pizza for breakfast, chugs Red Bull. It's funny because sometimes those real life situations can seem stereotypical or on the other side completely unrealistic. So sometimes I've had characters that are based on real people who I've had to sort of pull that back so that people actually believe that they're real characters, or that something like this could actually happen.
It is funny that, isn't it? Sometimes real life is too fantastical to put in a book, and then other times you'll put something in the book and somebody will go, oh, No. I don't think that's realistic, and it's just like the slightest nuance of something. And I always think that's quite funny, because when I watch programs or I read books, sometimes I'll read things, and you know that in real life that this wouldn't happen. You know, I know that in real life a private investigator wouldn't get the access to the information that Rowan gets. Fenway probably wouldn't get involved in an investigation as she does, but we all are happy to go on that journey for the sake of fiction, I think, and the sake of the characters, because it would be very dull if everybody just stayed in their lane, wouldn't it? It would, like, there'd be very boring books if everyone stayed in their lane.
Well, and certainly, you know, as mystery writers and as mystery readers, there are certain things that we can get away with. So, you know, the small town in California on the beach I went to school at Santa Barbara, California, which is on the ocean, and there are a bunch of little towns that I had to drive through between my parents' house and my university when I went down there, and and Estancia is a made up city on the California coast, but it is a combination of maybe 4 or 5 of these little towns / small cities that are there. And you know, the last time any of those places had a homicide was like 3 years ago, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the coroner is there for meth overdose deaths, right? But I know, you know, in the U.S. the TV series Murder, She Wrote was very popular, and that's on a coastal town in Maine on the East Coast, and on the northern East Coast. And you know, there were 150 murders in that town over the length of the series. That would never happen. But as mystery readers, it doesn't really matter to us. If that were in a romance book or in another genre, we wouldn't get away with that as writers. But in the mystery genre, there are certain things that are expected by the mystery readers out there, and that's one of those things that readers are happy to take the journey with us on.
Absolutely. Midsummer Murders is I kind of think Murder, She Wrote equivalent, the fact that it's a small village, or a connection of small villages in Midsummer that have an inordinate amount of murders, given the population.
Yeah.
So yeah, I used to joke to my husband, like, I would visit Hawaii, but there's way too many murders I've seen from Hawaii 5-0. It's far too dangerous. But yeah, you're right. We do get a lot of leeway. We get a lot of leeway with that, because I think, especially in a series, your readers get really invested in your characters. And I've thought about that a lot with Rowan and the cast of characters that I choose to bring with me. And as you go through a series, you occasionally pick up a new character where you think, oh, actually, I might want them in the future. They may be a keeper. How do you decide which of your characters are keepers and that you take with you, and which ones you kind of let go within the confines of that story?
You know, that's a really interesting question, because I'm mostly a discovery writer, or a pantser, as some people call it. And even when I do write out my plots, I find myself veering wildly away from the planned plot I had by about the 30% mark that I have, because you know, a conversation, a dialogue will happen in my mind, and it will trigger something in Fenway's memory that will lead her to, I'm like, okay, so I was going to have her go and investigate this, but obviously she's going to go do this first, which I really wasn't planning for another 4 chapters, and then it will just take on a life of its own. And characters are quite a bit the same way. So I had in the first book, Fenway has an assistant in the coroner's office, and the investigation really starts taking shape around her and her interaction with her dead former boss. And I thought she was going to be a major secondary character throughout the series. And she does appear quite a bit in book 2, and she is in book 3. But by book 5, she's been really relegated to the tertiary character. And Fenway gets a new assistant in book 6, who was a very interesting character, and helps Fenway out in a lot of different ways. She's rather the assistant is rather cunning and thinks differently than Fenway does, and so Fenway really thinks it's a good partnership, because Fenway thinks about problems one way, Sarah thinks about problems in another way, and the interplay between the two of them was something that I really liked. It kind of made the page, come alive when I was writing it. And when the page comes alive writing it, why force a different character into the scene? The first assistant was named Rachel. She was fantastic in the books where she was needed, but there isn't a big need for her after her promotion to come back, more than seeing her here and there in a chapter or two.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you say that you're a discovery writer. I'm exactly the same. And when I started writing Jack in a Box, the first of the Rowan books, I genuinely thought that her old boss Robbie would be a much bigger character to the series. I had in my mind that he would be almost like her foil, her person where she got information from. But actually, as that book went on, and I realized that wasn't quite right. He was a great character, and he does appear in he appears in all 4 books, but in book 4, it is really just a cursory text conversation that she asks him something, so it's nothing major. But his necessity kind of became less as other characters sort of naturally took their place. So it is quite interesting, and sometimes I get quite attached to the villains of the piece, because I quite like writing that side. They're never going to have a recurrence of character, likely, but I quite like writing those people as well, because I know that I can put all of that into that, the villain of the piece for that one, and then I'm letting them go. So I quite like that part of that, kind of the other side of characters as well.
Yeah, I think when you're a discovery writer, when things move naturally and when conversations evolve naturally, I find that it feels much more real and much more immediate. Now, and on the other side of that, what I did, especially in the first couple of books that I wrote, is scenes can meander particularly if you don't know where you're going, right? And this was one of the reasons why I rewrote the first third of The Reluctant Coroner, the first book, after I got a different editor for my second book, who's edited all of my mysteries since then, and he came back and said, "Paul, you really need to change the first 7 chapters of the Reluctant Coroner," and I did, and it's really improved my sales, and improved the number of the read through between book 1 and book 2. But in those first 7 chapters, I really didn't know where I was going, and so the original version of it did kind of meander, and there were, hey, let's meet the rest of the people who work in the coroner's office, and it was. Are we in a mystery? What's happening here? It's just people introducing themselves and stuff like that. So there is the danger of being the discovery writer and that. But I think it's if you have an idea where it's going, if you're bringing each character to the scene with an intention. What does Fenway want to get out of this? What does the lead detective, what does she want to get out of that? And how are those things in conflict? If you can bring that to the scene and let that evolve naturally, I think it's often it's the reason I'm a discovery writer instead of a plotter, because it feels much more natural and much less forced. I know a lot of plotters feel much differently, and they're really good at making the characters sound natural as they follow the plot that they've laid out. That's just not the way I write.
I don't think I could plot. I start a book with probably a really vague idea of what's going to happen. I know that someone, and I roughly know what the crime is going to be and how that's going to start. And mostly I know who the murderer is, but I don't always. And then there's a lot of gaps in between. I find that when I do that, by the time I come around to my redraft, I've got a lot of work to do to make everything marry up. And that was fine in the first couple of books because I was working my way through. But what I found as I've gone through into book 4 and book 5 is just sort of in the editing process just now, I need to keep kind of having a little note of what happened in previous books to make sure I've got good continuity. Do you keep a series Bible for that purpose, or?
You know, I have often wished that I did keep a series Bible, and I even hired somebody to write a series Bible for me, but they didn't do it. And I do find that I don't always keep as consistent as I would like to, especially with the secondary characters. I've just had my third book was just released as an audiobook, and I was working with the narrator, and I was proof listening to the book, and I realized that through the entire book I have a secondary character whose last name in this book is almost, but not quite, the last name that I had given this character in every other book in the series. And if I had had a series Bible and actually, paid attention to it, I would have been able to fix that. So it was a little late. I mean, I'm going to go back and fix it in this, because one of the great things about being an indie author is that if you find a mistake like that, you can go back and change it and re-upload everything. If you're a traditionally published author, you have a conversation to have with your publisher, and more often than not, especially if the book has been out for a while, the publisher's like, "Yeah, we already printed that. We're not going to change it."
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know Ian Rankin, who writes the Reaver series set in Edinburgh. He famously says that the first book he wrote in that series, he was at university or just left university, I think, and he gave Rebus some musical taste. I'm sure he made him like jazz, and Ian Rankin doesn't like jazz, and so he didn't envisage it being a series at that point. He just wanted to write a book, and then it turned to a series. So I'm sure he said that in subsequent books, Rebus no longer likes jazz. He likes a different type of music because he couldn't go back and change it. And I think that's quite interesting. And I was speaking to Marion Todd, and we did a video together, and she was saying she never has characters eat anything that she doesn't like to eat, because she's just like, oh, that's not very nice. So I think the quirks we bring into our characters are quite interesting. But do you have any of those sort of things where you wish you hadn't given somebody a characteristic, or you did give them it and you went back and changed it because you had the ability to do it?
I don't think, let me see. I don't think I've given anybody a characteristic that I've decided to change later. When we were talking about characters before, if they've got something about themselves that I find that's difficult to write, I will often just relegate them to the background and bring in another character who I think is better suited or more interesting to write. I do have I don't know if you do this, but I have a couple of Easter eggs in my books. Fenway in every single book in the series, except for the novellas, but in every single of the full novels, Fenway at some point is without a car for an extended period of time. So and it in Edinburgh or London, it might not be a big deal because public transport's actually a thing. But in California, and especially on the California coast, you can't get anywhere without having your own car or your own transportation. And so it really hamstrings her in the investigation in ways that I think are very interesting. It also forces her to ask for a ride from people, and so it's much more interesting to have a character have to ride in a car to discuss exactly what the next clue is, rather than have Fenway alone with her thoughts as she's driving to the next location. The other thing is a dinner that features pheasant as a main course is featured in almost all of the books. I wasn't able to in book 7, Fenway is accused of murder and is on the run, and so I couldn't figure out a way for her to stop at a nice restaurant and have a meal of pheasant there. But in every other book, she has pheasant for at least one meal.
So what's the story behind the pheasant then? I'm fascinated by that.
Well, so pheasant is one of my favorite dishes, and when I was writing my first book, her father takes her out to her estranged father takes her out to dinner to try to break the ice and try to get on track with having a relationship with his only child. And so he takes her to this fancy French restaurant. It's called Maxime's, and insists that Fenway order the pheasant. And Fenway doesn't want to order the pheasant, but does it anyway, and then tastes it, and it's delicious, and grudgingly agrees that maybe her father is right about something. He might have been horrible here, but he has good taste in food. And ever since then, that restaurant has featured. The restaurant was featured in the second book because one of the suspects is rich and was having dinner with the murder victim at this place. And then I thought, well, I've done it twice. I might as well just this restaurant and pheasant as a meal might as well feature in each book as I can do it.
Yeah, I think probably the only food that features in every book of mine is raw carrot cake. And because I have Rowan use the Sunshine Cafe as like a really sort of good meeting, a neutral meeting spot for meeting people she wants to interview or new clients, because I didn't really want them coming into her home. And because it's kind of like incense and wind chimes, and it's a little bit hippie as a place, but like with really solidly good people in it. So I decided to give her raw. In the first book, I said she should have chamomile tea and raw carrot cake. And I think that I had been on a bit of down a bit of a Google rabbit hole looking for things to make personally at home, because I love to cook. And I'd stumbled across raw carrot cake, and this had been something like, oh, that would fit with this. So I don't think there's been a book other than book 5, because I take her out of her hometown for book 5, that she doesn't have raw carrot cake. So that has been probably my sort of sequence of food. But there is a lot of food in my books, and I quite like that. I quite like that interlude, that social dynamic that's set up when people are eating. I think it creates something that's a bit different from any other environment, whether it be around the dinner table or a cafe or a restaurant, and in public places you also have that part where other people could hear your conversation. So it's quite a nice setup, I think. Although you can hear other people's conversations, which is also quite fun from a sort of like a mystery point of view.
Yeah, I think so many books, not just mysteries, but so many books kind of ignore the human need to eat, and meals feature very prominently in the Fenway Stevenson series. She finds a taqueria that she just loves, and so she eats there, and her favorite is lengua tacos, which is made of cow tongue, which everybody else in the book thinks is completely disgusting, but she loves. And it's one of those things, not only she's the kind of person who when she finds something, it doesn't matter if, she'll eat cow tongue as part of her and the way that other people react to it is also, it's also really nice to give them a little bit of depth of character, because when you have somebody who is a picky eater, that can show up, and then there are some other people who have they eat the quote unquote normal stuff, although what really is normal, and they're kind of disgusted by the stuff that is off the beaten path. And then there are the adventurous eaters, and there's of course they're not as easily categorized in those three areas, but there's a spectrum there, and it's really interesting. I think it really gives a nice rounded characterization to that, and not only what they eat, but how they react to what other people eat, or how other people are on the spectrum. Because you can have those adventurous eaters who shame the picky eaters, and the picky eaters who react in a disgusted way to the adventurous eaters. And then there's the people who just live and let live, right? It's not my thing, but if you want to eat it, hey, more power to you. And that is a really good way to, it goes to how they judge other people and stuff like that. It's I find it to be a really interesting way to round out a character.
Definitely. I find though, I've discovered that culturally, or like wherever you are situated in the world, some food and drink doesn't translate, and some things don't translate. So I'll sometimes get back from beta readers, I don't know what that is, and it kind of knocks me for a little minute, where I think, oh God, do you not have you never experienced? If I said, I mean, this is probably one that is more widely known. Like, most people know what iron brew is, because it's such a distinctly kind of Scottish drink. But there are other things where I think I've put them in books and people have been like, I don't know what that is. So sometimes I find I kind of caveat things, like I do a little intro at the beginning where I say, hey, all of my spelling is the British format, because my book's set in Scotland and I'm a British author. So, there's going to be U's and S's where you don't expect them if you're stateside, but that's the reason why. And now I've found myself adding in additional lines if I think there are things that properly won't translate, or things that came up in my beta reading where people were like, oh, I don't understand, I really don't understand that, but say I need it for the plot, or I just don't want to take it out. So I started to put like little caveats at the front of my book saying, hey, this is this, and this is what this means. Do you find there are things, if you have readers in the UK or maybe Australia, where like there are some barriers that you are surprised by?
Well, so I'm not sure if I would be surprised by them, because I've spent probably more time in the UK than most Americans have, and my wife is also Scottish. She's she's the first member of her family born in the US, and so her parents were born in Wee County, and I've known what iron brew is ever since I started dating her. But there are things, so there aren't very many things that I think I try not to be Americano-centric, because I know that over 30% of my readers are not in America, and it might actually be quite a bit higher than that. So I try not to be Americano-centric, and I think you probably saw we were texting in the group of authors where we're both part of. I had a big problem because in my other series, it's a series of poisoning murders, and there's a pain reliever that gets switched out. That is one of the ways that somebody gets killed. Well, in America, it's called acetaminophen, and the brand name is Tylenol. And in the UK, the brand is Panadol. And I can never pronounce that, but it's paracetamol. Is that it? Paracetamol.
Yeah.
So then people who are in the UK don't have any idea what acetaminophen is, and nobody in America knows what paracetamol is. So the way that I I had to figure out how to do that. And what I ended up doing was I ended up making the minor character of the medical examiner in that book. I made her British. And so she calls it paracetamol. And then all of my American characters go, what is that? And she's like, oh, you Yanks call it acetaminophen. That's right. So it's hopefully that is enough to make all of my American readers understand what that is, and make all of my readers outside of the US also understand what that is. But it sometimes requires quite a bit of creativity to get out of it. I'm also very conscious of phrasing. So there are because I know in America the first floor is the same as the ground floor, but outside of the US that's not the case. What we call the second floor in America is often called the first floor outside of the US. So whenever I'm talking about the ground floor, I try to call it the ground floor. If I call something, and I try to if I'm going to call something else something like the second floor, I always make sure not to count the number of stairways in there, so that it's not a confusing point for British readers versus American readers.
Yeah.
I also call them trousers, because that's a word that's the same in the US and the UK. But if you call them pants, which is a perfectly acceptable term in the US, that can mean underwear in the UK.
Yeah.
So there are little things like that I and I'm sure there are things that slip by me, but it's one of the reasons why I try to have beta readers who are in the UK, so that they can catch those sorts of things, and I can fix them before they go out.
I mean, I definitely fell into that trap when I wrote Bloody Snow, which is just a winter novella, and it's based around, like, there's a big part of it takes part around a pantomime, and I really didn't know that kind of theatre genre didn't translate across the world. So I found myself having to explain, like, a pantomime is a silly theatre production put on at Christmas. It usually is like Aladdin or things like that, Puss in Boots, and try and give an explanation. But I'd written the whole novella before I obviously got beta readers, and then people were like, I don't know what pantomime is, and I was like, oh God, like, and it's those bits where you're like, I had no concept that like I say, that theatre genre wasn't universal. So I think for me it's quite eye-opening to get beta readers from around the world. So I think that's quite important. But
Yeah.
it is the benefit of self-publishing, because you can add bits in to say.
Right. And there are some terms that people know, and they might be like, oh, that's an American term. So because my eighth book was set around the world of women's professional soccer / football,
Yeah.
I called it soccer because in America, football is something, we don't call it football. Football is a different sport in America, and in Europe they call it football, but soccer doesn't refer to any different sport.
Yeah.
Like if everyone outside of the US knows that those dumb Americans call it soccer, right? Which I found out, actually, the reason why it's called, and this is not really apropos to anything, but it's one of those bits of trivia that I just love. So back in the late 1700s, the British and the Americans called it association soccer, and there was also association football, and there was also rugby football. And rugby football at the time was sort of nicknamed ruggers, and association football at the time was nicknamed soccer. Well, that nickname fell out of favor in the British Isles. And so, 20 years later, everybody was back to calling it football, but the nickname stuck in the colonies. And so that's why it's called soccer. Here, it was originally a British term that just never went away in America. So
it's really strange how those things evolve.
Yeah.
you said that 30% of your readership is outside of the US. I think about 30% of my readership is in the US. Do you think about your international audience when you're thinking about your plots and things like that, or do you just think this is what I'm going to write about, and I will consider the other stuff in the edit process?
Probably more the last one.
Yeah.
I mean, if one of the reasons why I chose when I read about that coach who had done those horrible things, one of the reasons why I thought I could do that is because the sport itself is known around the world, no matter what it's called.
Yeah.
It's known around the world. So I guess in one way, I wouldn't have done that for American football, because it's not a sport that is known around the world. And I know I have Mexican food is very popular in America, particularly in California, and I know that it's not very popular in Europe, and in a lot of in Australia and New Zealand and some of the countries where I have a good readership, and it can feature prominently. But that's why I have a non-adventurous eater accompany Fenway to many of her Mexican food adventures, and it's not super critical to the plot either, right? If somebody doesn't know what horchata is, I make it very clear that it's a beverage and that it is a Mexican beverage, and that's pretty much all you need to know. You don't need to know that it's a cinnamon rice drink that has this history to it. You can look that up if you want to, but it's not really crucial to the plot.
Yeah, definitely. I think that I like all those little nuances in the story. When I'm reading, I like those things that are particular to characters and that they like, or they do, or they drink, or their habits. I think that they make up, that person. For me, Rowan is not a morning person. She has to learn to have meetings and do things in the morning, because she would quite happily begin her day around 2:30. She's had a long time of working nights, and so rectifying her sort of working clock is quite hard. But I think that's because I'm not naturally a morning person, so I totally relate to that. And that moment where she goes, God, please don't, like, when people go set up a meeting, if they say like 10 o'clock, she's like inwardly groaning, even though to the majority of people setting up a meeting at 10 o'clock seems like perfectly fine. She's like, why do I have to get that sort of time?
I think particularly if you've got something about yourself, like you're not a morning person, and to you 10 o'clock is still morning. Having that reaction, and you can make that really authentic in Rowan when you have that done, because I think that's one of the most authentic things about Rowan is her reaction to being forced to do things before noon. And I feel too that Fenway has a lot of things about me, and reacts to a lot of situations in the same way that I would, and I think that does make things more authentic. Now, I do have to be careful that I react and I think about things from a very male perspective here, and I can't have Fenway do that. So for instance, and I can't remember if it was in my first book or in my second book, but she is particularly frustrated and she decides to go for a long walk. Well, at the time, it's night and it's early-ish. It's like 8 or 9 o'clock. And I had in an early draft, I had her go for a walk by herself. And my early readers, all the women, were like, she would never do that. They're like, even in a sleepy California beach town, a woman would never go for a walk by herself at 9 p.m. at night if it was dark. So I those are things that I do have to be really, really careful about. But I think but other than that, I think having your main character react with a lot of the same quirky things about yourself really add to it and make things more authentic.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it is, I don't know why this is, but it seems probably harder for men to write authentic female characters, which I think you did really well with Fenway. I think that you don't have any of the kind of faux pas that you read about on social media where people pick things up. I think she comes across as a genuine, authentic female character. But it's a little strange, I think, sometimes that men don't always seem to do that as well as women seem to write male characters. And I don't really understand why that is. I've got a couple of prominent ongoing male characters in my books, George being the main one at the DI, detective inspector, and I think it comes across in a very I hope he comes across in a very masculine way, and very authentic to the profession he is. Do you think that it takes more thought to write an opposite gender character than a same gender character, or do you think because you're trying to put nuances of different personalities into each of them, it's a similar process?
Well, it's interesting. Even when I was in university majoring creative writing, I would often have my main characters as women. So I have quite a bit of experience with that. However, there are a lot of societal I don't know the right word, societal things. There's a long history, particularly in detective fiction, of female characters who are very one-dimensional, who exist for lack of a better term, for the male gaze in the story. Or either they're either the mom or the prostitute, right? That's the
Yeah.
And it's a stereotype, because you look at a lot of detective fiction that's written by men, particularly in the 20th century, and that's a lot of what you get. You get very flat female characters who strut around showing off their bodies for the male characters in the books. So there's sort of male authors who have read those books. That is their experience. And not only that, I mean, in real life, it is much more, less so now than it was, but certainly it hasn't gone away by any stretch of the imagination. The boys will be boys mentality when men treat women like objects, and that's, I think, why you get a lot of male authors who treat their female characters like objects. I know that I have some beta readers who have called me out on doing that myself. I try not to, but there are times when my male gaze will linger a little too long on certain characters I have, and they're like, "Why did you put that in? Like, why that turn of phrase?" And I'm like, "Oh, because I think that character is really pretty." So I've had, I'm really glad they call me out on that. I'm really glad I'm more aware of that than I used to be. And I know I can still fall into those ways of thinking. But I don't know why I have always been more interested in writing women main characters than male characters. It's always the way I've done it, and I think it does make things, in some ways it makes things a little bit more problematic for me, but it also keeps my my vigilance up over I have to write this character as a fully formed three-dimensional character because she's my protagonist.
I think one of the reasons probably one of the reasons that I write Rowan is such a feisty character is that as a reader, I felt like I got really frustrated when women were secondary characters and they were just a little pathetic in situations where you'd have them not knowing what to do, or hiding or not doing anything. And I felt like there just was such an inaccurate depiction of any woman I had ever met. I remember watching Reese Witherspoon do a speech once, she talked about, I think, setting up her own film company, and she said she was sick of getting scripts where the woman was like, would turn to the man and go, but what do we do now? And I totally get that kind of feeling that is the way that particularly crime fiction, I think, has been set up, or that the women in the stories have things happen to them to serve as a plot point for male detective or whichever. It's really nice to see there's so much more crime fiction that has three-dimensional female characters on both sides of the coin, whether not the villain or the protagonist. And I think that's nice that in the last 5-10 years, you've seen such a growth in that area. So yeah, and I think that I would probably struggle to write from a male point of view if that was my main character. And I can't really put my finger on why that is, except that I think probably I'm so drawn to writing that kind of, I hate the term sort of strong female character, but like kind of like feisty, determined female character who has their own agenda regardless of what everybody else around them thinks.
Yeah, I think a lot of people say that the romance genre has all of these rules that you have to follow, and it's very regimented. But for mysteries, I think it's almost equally, if not more, regimented than romance, because you have to introduce your killer in the first third of the book. Some people say the first quarter of the book, and that means you have to introduce, because your mystery readers have that expectation, that means you have to introduce all your red herring characters in the first quarter of the book as well. And the sleuth always has to be the one to not only figure out who the killer is, but also bring them to justice. It can't be one of those things that happens off stage where the killer gets away and then, oh, look, the police found him crossing the border into France, and brought, you can't have that. You have to have the confrontation with the sleuth, and I think because of that, if you're writing a sleuth who's a woman, that gives, you have to, because of the expectations of the reader, and just because it's a lot better book if your protagonist has the agency and the power to do those things, you have to do it that way.
Yeah, I in book 3, What You Didn't See, there's a fight scene where Rowan's physically fighting with a man, and the first time I wrote that fight scene, I was pretty pleased with it. But then a couple of my male beta readers were like, the kid's great, but if a normal sized man hit Rowan that hard, then I don't think she would get up. And I was like, okay, but I didn't want it to be really one-sided as a fight. I wanted it to be more equally matched. So I had to kind of reimagine that scene to make it so that she was more able to fight. Because whilst I totally think that women would fight back and they would do all that, there is the realistic part where they are potentially more likely to get knocked out or seriously injured from a mixed gender fight. And sometimes those things, whilst you've got a lot of leeway with fiction, I try to keep them relatively rooted in reality. So,
I do have Fenway. She doesn't get into a brawl or anything like that, but there are a couple times when she has to physically fight with other people, and she scraps quite a bit. But there's a reason that I made her 5'10".
Yeah.
And she's not a dainty 5'10". And it's funny because I've had some of my beta readers not not react well to the physical uh, uh, explanations that I have. And I'm not, you know, it's not negative that I'm doing it. And I think sometimes just the societal expectations of just explaining something,
Yeah.
explaining somebody who doesn't fit the Hollywood stereotype of what of what, you know, Margot Robbie is, for
Yeah.
example. Some of them feel like that is a negative thing when you're just describing it, which is kind of terrible.
Yeah.
And so walking that line is hard. But I mean, my character is who she is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that women are can be quite scrappy when the need arises. So what's coming up for Fenway? You're on book 8
Oh,
is
I'm on. It's funny. I had the idea that this would be a 7-book series.
right.
And I said that she is, you know, the estranged father. The arc, the emotional arc she takes with her, not only her father, but her mother who passed away from cancer just before book 1 starts. Her relationship with both of them is explored pretty thoroughly in that 7-book arc.
Yeah.
And it ends, the family arc ends at the end of book 7.
Yeah.
So I thought I was done with that series. And then my readers were like, when's book 8 coming out? When's book 8 coming out? Is book 8 coming out now? How about now? Is it coming out now? And I thought that would die down, and it just got,
Yeah.
so I'm like, all right, well, maybe I need a new arc for her now.
Yeah.
And so the new arc is because she has some abandonment issues. She has never really been in a relationship that's lasted longer than 3 months, except for this fella that she has had through the first 7 books. So the next set of books, and I haven't quite figured out how many of the next set of books there are going to be, explores her trying to actually be in a grown-up relationship that actually has commitment, that she feels like she can't run away from, that she doesn't want to run away from, but that every fiber of her being is scared and wants her to run away. So that's sort of the second series. The book 8 started to explore that. Book 9, her in book 9, her boyfriend is going to be leaving for an extended period, and they're trying to stay together during that time, and he rents a storage space. Fenway has to, because her boyfriend is a private investigator, he's out on a case, so she has to pick up the keys for him and goes to open up the storage space, and there's a dead body inside. That's the premise of book 9.
I love that.
So,
That sounds brilliant. So at least another 6 books, 5 books for Fenway.
I'm thinking at least 5 for this arc, and depending on how this next arc is received, I may do another arc. One of the things for this arc too is I do a lot. I give book 1 away as you know, the way to get readers interested in trying book 2. With this new arc, I could eventually give book 8 away in 2 or 3 years, or maybe less than that, to try to, you know, get people hooked on this set of novels, and then hopefully go back and try book 1 again and come forward. I've also got another idea in my head. I love those time loop movies like Groundhog Day. There was one that came out in 2020 called Palm Springs. It stars Andy Samberg. There's an Amazon teen romance called the Map of Tiny Perfect Things. And even the action movies, like I know in America it's a Tom Cruise movie called The Edge of Tomorrow. I think it had a different title in the UK, something like Kill, Die, Repeat, or something like that. But it's a time loop
Yeah.
movie, and I love those. And I'm thinking about a detective who wakes up in a time loop, and when they go back to the beginning, instead of waking up that day like they do in Groundhog Day, that detective wakes up at the time of the murder
Nice.
and cannot break the loop until the detective solves the murder. So I think that's a really interesting idea. I know that it devolves into science fiction, which is not something I ever thought I would write.
Yeah.
I kind of want to market that more as a mystery than as a science fiction. But I'm really interested in the idea, and I'm hoping to explore that with my next series. Although I don't know when I'm going to have time to write it.
Find that I think that I have more ideas than I have time for, which is a bit saddening. But just recently, I've been thinking about starting writing a new series. But there's also, I've got a couple ideas for what I think are probably standalone books, but might not be. And I would quite like a bit of a time loop, to be fair. So I could just be like, that time loop, I can stay in it until I've written the book and then just go back. That would be quite handy. But I really enjoy writing Rowan. So for me, book 5 is in the editing stage, and book 6 is in the writing stage. So I never had a sort of like final point for. I just thought, as long as I can think of ideas that feel fresh, and I'm going to enjoy writing, and I'm not going to feel too repetitive, then I'll keep going. So yeah, there'll be a few more Rowan books coming up. So
I think writing series is great. And I like reading in series too. I know there are some writers who don't like writing in series, or readers who don't like reading in series. There are times when, you finished a book and you're like, all right, well, now I don't have anything to read. And you have to ignore the big pile of books on your nightstand. But if you go out there in a bookstore and browse, or if you go onto Amazon or Kobo, or your e-retailer of choice and browse, if you find something that's a book 1 in a series, and if it's a long series, sometimes that's scary, but sometimes that's good. And if you like that book 1, at the end of that book 1, if it's a standalone, you end it and you're like, now I don't have anything to read again. But if it's book 1 of 7, you're like, well, now I know what my next 6 books are that I'm going to read.
Yeah, I love doing that, and I think because I love reading series is why I've chosen to write a series. So yeah, so I'm really excited for Lies She Didn't Tell to come out on the 11th, which is a week from our date of recording, and having it out in the world. I just want to say thank you, Paul, so much for having this chat with me today. It's been so much fun, and I absolutely could continue chatting for so much longer, but I think we probably should wrap it up.
Right.
I was going to say that I'm going to do a giveaway of a copy of Jack in the Box. So if you're in the UK, it will be a signed copy that I'll send you. If you're elsewhere in the world, then it will be, I'll send it via Amazon to your address. And if you like, and put a comment in the comments on the social media platform that you're watching this on, then I will put you into a digital hat and draw somebody out, and I'll be announcing those either on the 11th or on that weekend.
And I'm going to give away the ebook version of the first Fenway Stevenson collection, books 1 through 3. And I'll follow the same rules that Angela is following as well. So draw names out of a hat. Since I'm based in the US, and I know most of the viewers here are in the UK, it'll be fulfilled electronically.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Paul, and say goodbye to everybody for just now. It's been so much fun. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Angela.